If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Romans, the 14th chapter. This is where we will spend our time today. It's interesting to me, I've made note of this before, how literal the statement is when we speak it. When we say, I am spending time. No matter what it is we're spending the time on. It is, I would say, the most literal statement a human being can utter, because the arrow of time moves forward always. Time goes away. It leaves and never returns. We don't save it, even though we use that term very frequently. I'm saving time by doing X, Y, or Z. We are literally spending it no matter what we do. Even as we're in here today and we're going through the process of this sermon time or this church service, we are spending that time. It's kind of like being a tightrope walker in many respects, as Paul will point out to us today. On the one hand, if we're walking a tightrope, we have both of our hands usually on a pole, that very long pole that they use in order to balance, aid in the balance. On one end of the pole, we've got Christian liberty, and on the other end of the pole, we've got love for our neighbor and love for others. And we balance those two things constantly as we move through life, spending the time that we've been given. Let's take a look at this text and see how Paul would speak to us through it today. I'll begin reading in verse 17. The kingdom of God is not a matter of eating or drinking, but of righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. Because anyone who serves Christ in this way is pleasing to God and approved by all people. Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. All food is clean, but it is wrong for anyone to eat anything that causes someone else to stumble. Is it better not to eat meat or drink wine or to do anything that will cause your brother or sister to fall? So, whatever you believe about these things, keep them between yourself and God. Blessed is the one who does not condemn themselves by what they approve. But the one who eats, who has doubt, is condemned if they eat, because their eating is not from faith, and everything that is not from faith is sin. Paul nor Jesus, nor anything in the New Testament for that matter, set all of the parameters for us, do they? I have said, and I say it still to this day, I've been a Christian for 34 years, and I say still, that it would be much easier if there were that list that I could look to and say, oh, I know exactly what I'm not supposed to do here and what I am supposed to do there. And this is hard. This is one of the areas of walking with Jesus as a believer that is very difficult. And Paul nor Jesus resolved these issues for us. Now, there are places where we have commandments and we know what they are. But there are so many areas in living as we spend this time, quite literally, that fit in the cracks. They don't have direct application biblically. And we're to work out our salvation, Paul says. But then he also says we're to appear at the judgment seat of Christ. So if I had that list, boy, it would just make everything simpler. This is one of the appeals, I believe, in our world for Islam. They have that list. They know which leg to put their leg into their pants, whether they're sitting or standing, which side of the table the fork is supposed. I mean, every little thing, which hand you shake. All of these details of living are lined out for the Muslim. But for the Christian, God leaves it up to us, a lot of it. A lot of it is up to our conscience. I remember reading about a famous preacher by the name of Donald Ray Barnhouse. You may not know who he is, but he had a large church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for a very long time. And he was running a summer conference wherein there were a lot of youth. And some moms who had attended with their children, or who'd come along as chaperones, I guess, came up to him just in absolute panic and shock. Well, what was the problem? Dr. Barnhouse, did you know that there are girls here with no stockings on? Are you going to go and tell them they need to put their stockings on? Oh, they were just incredibly upset. Donald Ray Barnhouse who, as you may or may not know, was known as the great illustrator in his life. You could sit down with him at a restaurant, he could take any articles on the table and illustrate a point of the gospel or a point of biblical teaching. He was just incredibly good at that. He looked at the women and stood there for a second, I'm sure his mind working on this problem, and he said, well, did you know that Mary, the mother of Jesus, wore no stockings? And they said, no, we didn't know that. That's right. He said, because they didn't exist. In that time of history, something of that fine a stitch pattern would have been nearly impossible to obtain, and if you could obtain it, nobody of Mary's standing in the community could afford it. Oh, well, we didn't realize that. He said, now, do you know when stockings started to appear in history? They said, no. He said, in the 15th century. He said, do you know who wore them? They said, no. Prostitutes. First women to show themselves in public wearing stockings were prostitutes. Why was that? Well, they could afford them. Prostitute being a fairly lucrative trade, I suppose, in the 15th century. He said, and after that, some noble women started to wear them because they were expensive, and it became a sign of status. At first, of course, there was a scandal that these women were wearing the same things that the women of the night had worn. But then over time, it became a mark of a person who was affluent, a woman who was affluent. Then men started to wear them a century or so later, and pretty soon they became the style. He said, now they're not the style. They're the style for your generation, but for your daughters, in the summer, bare legs are just normative. He said, you need to let that go. You need to let that go, and I'm not going to say anything to them. Now, Paul, in some ways, is echoing Donald Gray Barnhouse, but in a different way. Or I guess you'd say Donald Gray Barnhouse was echoing Paul. What Paul admonishes here is self-restraint toward liberty. He's telling you and me that because we do have this liberty in Jesus, that we have to exercise some conscience, some control within it so that we don't hurt other people. That's why Islam hates the West, because we don't have these scruples that we obey so strictly, and they're looking at us and saying, you need Sharia in order that you can control yourselves. Well, this argument is not a new one. The Bible gives us a prescription, and that prescription, if we read it carefully, is for the highest level of tolerance of anyone in the culture. We should be, as Christians, the most tolerant of people in that proper sense of the word, tolerance. Now, at our present time, tolerance is the highest virtue in our country. In our present ethos, to be seen as a very tolerant person is to be seen exercising the highest possible ethic. And the Bible is telling me, if I'm reading it correctly, that tolerance has been our ethic for 1900 years and change. Paul is writing to a church wherein you've got Roman pagan converts and you've got Jewish converts. And the Jews in this congregation were, just as all Jews were in that time in history, scrupulously vigilant toward all of the Jewish kosher laws and regulations. They got born again. They didn't lose those scruples. The pagan, on the other hand, had no scruples whatsoever. They got born again. They believed that Jesus had died for them, and they got saved, and the Spirit of God filled them up, and they didn't think these scruples mattered at one whit. So here you've got these two groups looking at one another. One says you ought to obey the scruples. The other says we don't care about the scruples. What are you going to do? Well, Paul lists three elements that should compose the life of the congregation and the individuals within it. And he lists them this way. He says the first one is righteousness. That is, in effect, giving to God what is due God and giving to others what is due to them. And the two things are linked. Now, you may say, well, I don't really understand. Well, it's very clear in Scripture. John says it quite well. He says the evidence that you belong to Jesus is that you love one another. Well, the two are linked here. We can't serve God. We might say it, but we can't really serve God and neglect people at the same time. It's just not possible. The priesthood is no longer doing these services in front of God. The priesthood is how we live our lives. We are all a kingdom of priests now. There is no laity anymore. And so we have this obligation now To be a priest before God is to love other people. Scripture makes it so plain here. Jesus said we are blessed if we hunger and thirst for this righteousness. So that's part of our job too, is to seek it out. And others are due our consideration, they are due our sympathy, no matter who the person is. There is no righteousness apart from consideration of other people. There just isn't. We're not doing the obscure priestly ritualistic functions anymore. And the way in which we function as priests is we love each other. Now, he says peace. He's not saying just an absence of conflict. He's saying, what is it that makes for human flourishing in peace? If we think that we will follow Jesus to do whatever we like, we will not flourish because we will have no peace. We will be in conflict with others. We'll be harming others, perhaps unintentionally, but still the harm goes on. If there is truly peace with God in a person, you'll notice something about that person as time goes on. They are very peaceful in themselves, but they're also very difficult to disturb. This is critical in the life of the church. A person who is peaceful before God within a congregation isn't offended easily. They're not taking the slights as slights. And in many respects, a person who's at peace before God really doesn't care in that sense of not indifference or a chip on their shoulder, but they really are unaffected by what other people think of them in the deepest sense of the term. And so they're not going to be offended if you don't like the kind of music they like, or if you think the drapes aren't the right color. They're not going to be bothered by any of that. Then Paul says, joy, which is an inner condition that isn't moved by the externals. Now that's a very high ideal, and I realize that. Paul tells us, commands us practically to be joyful in everything. Very difficult. But this is where interaction matters a lot, you see. When Paul uses the two words weak and strong in this context, he is using a term that was used within the context of the congregational setting. It's not a term he's making up. These aren't terms that Paul's just coining here. The weak were those who were Jewish converts who held to the scruples and saw them as very important even after they were born again. They didn't quite appropriate the freedom that Jesus' death on the cross had bought for them. They didn't quite appropriate the significance of the rending of the veil of the temple from top to bottom. They didn't quite get that. And so when it came time for them as born-again believers to perhaps loosen on some of these kosher laws, they were weak in that sense of being unable. Then you have the strong. Who are the strong? They were the ones who were the pagan converts. They were freed up from the scruples to start with, and then they became born again, and they didn't see any significance to those scruples whatsoever. You go back to Acts 15, and you see the church council that took place. You see that the argument was about this very thing. Paul's letter to the church at Galatia is about this very thing. The Jewish mind, and be sympathetic toward them. I'm not being accusatory here. I'm just saying it for what it was. The Jewish mind could not let go of all that they had known for hundreds and hundreds of years. All that they had been taught that they had to keep in order to please Yahweh. Well, Jesus came and died on the cross for them, and they no longer had to do that. And the pagan didn't get it. They just thought, what is that? I don't care. I don't care. I like pork. It didn't bother them, and I don't care that these fabrics are mixed in my clothing. This is what I can afford to wear. Jesus died for my sins. I'm born again. I don't have to care about those things. These two things were where the conflict arose. The weak would diminish joy in being a disciple of Jesus via their legalism and holding it over the strong. The strong would diminish the joy of the weak in their insistence on their rights as new believers, as believers set free and having liberty. Flourishing in joy, as Paul speaks of it here, is neither flaunting of rights, nor is it judgmentalism caused by obedience to scruples. There can be no true joy in believing, in following Jesus, if we're harming others in order to live our liberty. That's what Paul is speaking to here. During World War II, And I know there's somebody in this room who's quite aware of this history, so this won't be anything new for them. But during World War II, you had what were known as the maritime flotillas. These were large convoys of maritime vessels, not military vessels. They would have passengers on them and goods and food and all kinds of things. But during World War II, we utilized them as vehicles to convey military machinery, material as it was known in the military, across the ocean to our European allies to aid them during World War II. Even before we entered the war, we did this. Well, the German submarine wolf packs would come out and sink as many of these vessels as we could. Thousands of them were sunk. I mean, it was incredible. I thought about that one time, and it almost made me nervous for the amount of steel that went to the bottom of the ocean. Well, the flotillas were organized hundreds of vessels at once, and they would stay together. Why? There are only so many torpedoes. The Germans could only sink so many vessels, and you would read in the newspapers the outrage at this passenger vessel that had been sunk by the Germans. Well, it wasn't quite true, because a lot of those vessels were filled with military material, and they were conveying it across the ocean. But the vessels, the maritime vessels, would stay together in that pack. And that grouping, they knew that there were only so many torpedoes and that the majority of the vessels would get through, even though some would be sunk. And they would only go as fast as the slowest vessel. That was very critical. And that's kind of what Paul is saying to you and to me. He is saying to us, do your lives tear people down by the fact that you, in your liberty, run ahead and leave others behind? Or do your lives build others up? Now, in our case, in the modern world, in our churches, us here in this room, I'm going to say it's a mix. There are some things about us that build others up. There are some things about us that tear others down. But there's a good test. And Paul gives us the test right here in the text. That test is our exercise of our freedom from a clear conscience, or do we doubt? Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the great preacher, I mentioned him last week with regard to him winding up as the spokesface for advertising for cigars, because he smoked so many cigars. What I didn't go on to say was there came a point at which, when he realized that his face was used to advertise the cigars, he gave them up. Why? He had all liberty to keep smoking them. Nobody could tell him. I mean, there was nothing biblical that said one way or the other about smoking cigars. He gave them up because he recognized that he was causing people to stumble. Some will disobey conscience for popularity. Some will disobey their conscience for conformity. Some will disobey their conscience because what they're disobedient in, they just happen to like. When we do that, we are in sin. Pure and simple. Now, conscience is not infallible. But there is one thing that is infallible, and that is to defy one's own conscience is sin. Paul gives us 4 elements to keep in obedience as we live this life. Never cause someone else to stumble for an avoidable reason. Charles Haddon Spurgeon. He could avoid smoking cigars. Live on the earth as a citizen of heaven, focused on the eternals, not on the externals. Be active in pursuing the good of others and do all things with a clear conscience. When I look at that list as it is in this text, both by inference and by direct reference, I say to myself, what else is there as a Christian? If I'm going to live in this world as a disciple of Jesus, I know there are other things, but when it comes to human interaction amongst believers, what else is there? And if we were to live consciously in this way, our devotion would become visible to other people. Not that we would become appearing to be so holy, but that we would live in a way that does look different than this world. Because the proper believer's life, just got to face the facts of it, is interdependent. And love is the demonstration of the believer's life. We're utterly free, as Martin Luther said, subject to none, yet servant to all, as Martin Luther said. Once we were slaves to our habits, now we're freed from those habits. But without this demonstration of love to each other, we are not the church. Now, how far does this go? And that's a very good question. We've had numerous Wednesday night discussions about this. How far do these things go? Are the weak in the faith to be the arbiters of our liberty? When we're with them, yes. When we're with them, yes. If someone in this room, or anybody who claims to be a follower of Jesus, has a need in all instances to prove their liberty, that is a tyranny. Now I'm going to tell a story about my own experience in this. When I first became a Christian, and you all know the history of that, I don't want to go into all that, but right after I became a Christian, I began to travel very shortly on I was a young Christian, months. I had been a Christian for, May, April, June, July, August. June, July, August, 3 months, and I'm traveling with a band. And these bands, what struck me, I didn't know anything about Christianity. I'd just become born again. I didn't know anything about authors and luminaries in the faith, but it didn't take long before I heard names pitched around. And the next thing I know, I'm sitting across a table eating Subway sandwiches with somebody who's in the Christian world very famous. This happened a lot. And I look back on it now and I just marvel at the numbers of Christian luminaries with whom I had meals, stayed in hotel rooms, sat with at tables, sat with at conferences, sat with in meetings after and before events that we were doing the music for, and they were doing the speaking and teaching. I mean, it was amazing to me. I look back on it and I just think, gosh, what a privilege. But as a young Christian, I began to notice something about some of these folks. I noticed at the meetings where we would all be there, some of them would use foul language. And they didn't use it in just an oppressive, frequent way like you would hear in a movie or something. They used it for color, but they used it. Now, I came from heavy construction as an industry. The construction industry, we had a foreman, and I won't say where, who we all called on the job site Hollering Harold. Hollering Harold. Why was that? Well, Harold would put his face, he always used to have this white foam in the corners of his mouth because he was screaming all the time. He screamed at everybody. He screamed at you when you were talking to him in a calm way, unless you're in a room. But if you were outdoors, he was screaming. Harold could take profanities and compose whole paragraphs, and people understood what he was saying. He spoke profanity. I mean, the movies don't do it justice. There are a couple of atheists with whom I correspond who use a lot of profanity. They've got nothing on Harold. They can't shock me. I've heard it all, and I've heard it all at high volume and day in and day out. Well, when I became a believer, the first thing that God worked on me about was profanity, that I had to cease to use it. And so it took a while. It was hard because I was just in that world and that's how I spoke. Well, to hear these Christian luminaries use it, the first thing I thought was, well, I guess when you reach a certain maturity level as a Christian, it's okay to use profanity. So in a couple of instances, I tried it. It didn't fit very well. And I came away from that whole period, and for a long time, I stumbled over this. I was stumbling over the fact that I was judging them for the fact, these Christian luminaries, for the fact that they used profanity in their speech. What was happening? I was weak, and I was falling, judging other people. So I know exactly what Paul is speaking about here. You see, in the end, our lives should produce over time righteousness. Now, if there is an ideal of righteousness, I don't know exactly what it is. I know, though, over time, if I walk with the Lord, slowly but surely, until the end of my life, I'll gradually produce more of it. What does this mean? What this means is, for you and me, is just what Psalm 42 says, as the deer pants for the streams of water, so my soul pants after you, O God. My soul thirsts for the God, the living God. I'm just going to ask us the question, as we live amongst each other, as we spend our time spending the believer's life, that's what we're doing. Are we spending it properly, in that the paramount search for us in our lives is to search for God and to thirst for Him and relationship with Him? If that's the case, then a lot of these things that Paul speaks to us about here will take care of themselves. But can we honestly say that we thirst after God? I don't know where everybody is today, but if there's anything I've said about which you have a question, you want to pray with me,